Grew up in Southern California and loved the outdoors. But as a young girl, she was stung by hundreds of bees. It was a terrifying and traumatic event. Yet ironically, instead of being afraid, Rhea developed a fascination with bees and began caring for them and harvesting their honey. And it may have been a blessing in disguise, because in her 20s, when Rhea began suffering from debilitating pain and limited movement, and her doctors diagnosed her first with multiple sclerosis and then Lyme disease, it would be the bees that would come to her rescue.
And going back into my days of working as a nursing assistant in Connecticut, I have a very vivid memory of a man who was severely stricken with multiple sclerosis. He was 42 years old, and he was tube-fed. He couldn't produce a cough. He was total care, bedridden, and it scared me. Cancer didn't scare me. Other ailments and maladies didn't scare me, but multiple sclerosis stuck in my mind, and it was one of my biggest fears. There was an Army nurse that worked in the nursing home that said, well, if you reach age 40 and you haven't developed multiple sclerosis, you're not going to. And I remember wishing to be 40 years old to pass that time. And here it was, I turned 41 years old, and given that diagnosis was like a death sentence. I had a wonderful childhood growing up in Santa Barbara. My family and I lived very close to the ocean, and a lot of my time was spent down at the beach. I became fascinated with honeybees and was given my first hive when I was age 12. They have fascinated me ever since.
As Rhea grew up, she never lost her passion for bees. Even after moving cross-country from California to Connecticut when she was 22.
It was always my desire to get onto the East Coast, a little more rural living. We lived in the woods. I was always in the woods. I started noticing some strange symptoms going on with myself in the early 1980s. I was developing rashes. I had gone to a doctor about the rash. He had prescribed a topical medication which was very ineffective, and then I just kind of ignored it. The rash would come and go.
Rhea and her husband moved to Vermont after falling in love with rural living, and she started keeping a beehive again. Soon her little bee farm grew to 10 hives.
Unfortunately, the marriage did not work out, and we were divorced in 1988, but I continued to live here. Probably about 1991, my symptoms, besides a rash, were becoming increasingly more frequent. They were also associated with back and neck pain. I had gone to a doctor. They originally had thought maybe it was rheumatoid arthritis, but I did not test positive with the RA factor. Later on, besides having joint pain associated with this, I was also beginning to have neurologic symptoms, but they would come and go. I would think maybe I have the flu. Even during the summer, it would last 3 days and then the symptoms would just disappear. In about 96, 97, I had a fall on some steps, and it required that my knee was operated on. I never fully recovered from the problem. Shortly after that, my symptoms became increasingly worse. Instead of every 6 months, these attacks would come down to every 4 months.
Unable to work because of her injured knee, Rhea moved back to California in 1999.
Shortly after deciding to make the move, my symptoms, neurologic symptoms, were becoming increasingly worse. Instead of every 6 months to 4 months, these symptoms had now come down to these attacks at every 2 weeks. I would wake up with massive headaches that would last 3 days. I couldn't be exposed to light because it would hurt my head and my eyes so much more, and very intensified, and my legs felt like they were constantly vibrating. And then after 3 days of these symptoms, they would just disappear on their own. I had gotten to a point where I had Bell's palsy on the left side of my face, my eye drooped, the corner of my mouth pulled up. I was having brain fog, memory lapses. I was dropping things. My cognitive abilities were being compromised. I was hitting door casings. I finally went to a doctor after I had stepped off a curb and landed straight on my face. And my initial diagnosis in one day was multiple sclerosis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia. Given that diagnosis was like a death sentence.
For 20 years, Rhea Carlson's body was crying out that something was wrong. She endured a strange set of symptoms: numbness in her hands, tingling in her feet, pain in her legs, back, and neck, blurred vision. Then finally she received a dreaded diagnosis: multiple sclerosis. And as if that weren't bad enough, Rhea's doctor also suggested that they run tests for Lyme disease.
Lyme disease is an infection from the spirochete called Borrelia burgdorferi, and it is a spiral-shaped bacteria that is typically transmitted by ticks. And it was discovered in Lyme, Connecticut, hence the name.
In the summer of 1994, I remember thinking that I had had food poisoning because I was violently ill, fever, vomiting, my body ached. I had developed a bullseye rash on my calf. My tick exposure was so frequent. A Lyme disease specialist said, because I had lived in New Milford, Connecticut during the 1980s, he would go ahead and have me tested, put me on a regimen of antibiotics for 3 weeks, and at that time was to go and have my blood drawn. 3 weeks later, I was given a positive diagnosis, highly positive. Markers were just off the charts for Lyme disease infection, along with 2 other co-infections, bacterial and 1 parasitic, all transmitted by the bite of a tick. I was excited. I mean, Lyme disease versus multiple sclerosis, I thought this is great. And I remember saying to him, so what does this mean, another 2 or 3 weeks of antibiotics? And he was silent for a moment, and he said, you're looking at a minimum of 2 years to possibly off and on for the rest of your life of antibiotic therapy. I had never heard of infection having to be treated for so long. And at that point, I did start to educate myself about Lyme disease.
Lyme disease was discovered only a few decades ago, and it can be tricky to diagnose.
It's known as the great imitator because it can cause any multitude of symptoms. Chronic symptoms such as MS will get diagnosed even though it's Lyme, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, lupus, it affects the immune system, the gastrointestinal system, so it really can affect any part of the body, and everyone's different.
Some people can be infected with Lyme disease and be asymptomatic, meaning they show no symptoms whatsoever. And there are other people that immediately begin to show flu-like symptoms, joint pain, neurologic problems.
The key with Lyme disease is catching it early. If you do that, treatment is pretty straightforward, several weeks or probably a month to be sure of intravenous antibiotics, oral antibiotics, at least high dose. But once you let it go longer than that, it's a prescription for disaster.
One thinks that when you start antibiotics to get well, that you start feeling better. And I can tell you right now, I did not feel better. I felt worse. And my symptoms continued to worsen for the first 2 years. And it was not until the end of 2 years where I started to have some good days. And in this time, I had lost my eyesight on 2 occasions. I had chronic pain in my spine and my head. I had tremors. I shook. My speech was very slurred. At times, I could not feed myself. I had no control of bladder. At times, it was just horrific. One of my favorite things to do was to play piano. I lost the ability to play piano. It was not being dead that frightened me. It was the dying, because my abilities were being robbed from me very quickly. Thoughts had crossed my mind that I was dying, and that if I wasn't dying, that maybe I would be better off not being alive. I remember at one point, and this is after I had initiated treatment, had been well into treatment, Two friends of mine that I had known since junior high school had come to visit me shortly before Christmas. And I remember saying to them, if there's anything in this house that means anything to you that is mine, you put your name on it. I'm not going to make it.
Maria Carlson was in a state of despair over failing health because of advanced Lyme disease. But she had a gut feeling that she needed to connect to nature for a cure. So once again, she took up her passion for beekeeping. This time, though, not for the bees' honey, but for the venom in their sting. It was a radical idea that Rhea had heard about years earlier, but up until now had given little thought to. Could it be that the cure to her health problems was right in front of her since her first childhood bee sting?
While living in Versher, Vermont, a man had come to the door with a jar in his hand, and he wanted to buy some bees from me. I couldn't understand why a person would want a jar of bees other than that possibly they were thinking maybe the bees in the jar would make honey for them. And I remember saying to him, they're not going to make honey for you. He said, no, I am stinging myself. And I was a little taken back. I remember reading about bee venom being good for people with arthritis, and when he said that he had MS, the thoughts came through my mind such as, are you crazy?
The man who came to Rhea's door was a local carpenter who had multiple sclerosis.
I lost my sight a lot of times. It overlapped once, so that both eyes were one going away, one coming back.
A friend with rheumatoid arthritis told Paul about a Vermont man named Charles Mraz, who treated her symptoms successfully with bee sting venom. She urged Paul to visit Mraz.
When I first heard about bee venom therapy, I thought it was insane.
Though he had doubts, Paul took his friend's advice and went to see Charles Mraz for his first dose of bee venom therapy. He could hardly believe it. The aches and pains in his joints and muscles improved.
I started reading about it. I found the American Apitherapy Society, which was founded by Charles Mraz.
Charles Mraz is known as the modern-day father of bee venom therapy. Just like Rhea, he had a lifelong fascination with bees. He first heard about using bee stings to relieve arthritis pain when he was a young man working for beekeepers.
Back then in Vermont, farms were small, usually 20 to 50 cow type farms. Farmers would come with arthritis in their hands. Of course, milking by hand is hard work. And they would get arthritis in their joints and things, and then, of course, they would have trouble. It'd be very painful for them to milk. So they would come to him and say, I need some bee stings for my arthritis. And so he thought, what the heck, just a few bees? He'd give them to him. He noticed it seemed to work.
Over the years, Charles refined his techniques. He kept a journal where he tracked the amazing success rates of people whose arthritic pain vanished with bee sting therapy. But how does the therapy actually work?
It's not a simple chemical in bee venom. There's all kinds of proteins and amino acids and hormones, and it's not like aspirin or something.
Melatonin is the major component of bee venom, comprises a large percentage of it, and we're finding that it has some interesting biochemical properties, primarily anti-inflammatory in its effect, and interacts with the human genetics to suppress inflammation.
The body is essentially fighting the venom. It's stimulating the body's immune system. It increased production of cortisone, which is a known, anti-inflammatory type substance, but it's not added. It's not in the bee venom. It just stimulates your body to produce more of it.
At first, I'm thinking this is absolutely insane. It's enough to get stung accidentally when you're working with the bees, moving hives and collecting honey and stuff, but to do it on purpose was a stretch, but she went into it full blast.
There are two ways of applying bee stings. You can apply bee stings either with the live bee, and the other way is by injecting it. And we have a supply of injectable bee venom that we put in an hypodermic syringe mixed with a little bit of anesthetic, and people seem to respond well to that also.
About 65,000 Americans use bee sting therapy, a component of apitherapy, which also includes the medicinal use of honeybee products like bee venom, honey, pollen, royal jelly, and beeswax. But, like most natural therapies, bee sting therapy is controversial within the conventional medical establishment. Mainstream doctors are quick to point out that bee stings can be fatal for some people, but practitioners like Rhea always take very strict precautions.
I tell my clients, never underestimate the power of a single bee sting. It is very powerful, something that has the ability to cause a person to break out in hives from head to toe. Within my reach of stinging clients is an injection of epinephrine and also antihistamine.
Rhea began stinging herself on a daily basis, sometimes as many as 65 stings at a time. But she also continued with the antibiotics her doctor had prescribed.
I would get initial relief of pain, but it would seem like the next day I had this downside.
That was the toughest part, is just seeing her decline.
I was on a downswing for 2 years. I did not get better for 2 years. Once in a while I would have a day that was better. But come to find out that that was all part of the normal healing process. It is known in the medical books as Herxheimer reaction. Basically what is going on is that I was killing off a bacterial infection in my body at a rate faster than what my body could rid itself of this dead and dying bacteria, which becomes toxins, and it actually makes you feel worse before you feel better. My Lyme disease specialist encouraged me to continue using the bee venom, so I was well on the right track, and that was just the beginning of it all.
Rhea Carlson had found the medicine that would heal her, in a beehive of all places. By combining antibiotics and the venom from bee stings, she was able to reverse the unbearable symptoms of Lyme disease.
At the time that the man had come to my door for bees for stinging himself, I never knew the impact that this man and Charles Mraz would eventually have on my own life, that I was going to be in need of being stung by honeybees for medicinal purposes. I don't think that with antibiotic therapy alone that I would have made the progress that I have made, and I also don't think that just doing bee stings would have gotten me to where I am today. But I really stuck with the regimen, and I am so thankful that I did, and so thankful for the people that I had that helped me out during my desperate time of being so ill.
Rhea took doctor-prescribed antibiotics for 3 years, but she finally had enough of the side effects and decided that she and the honeybees would go it alone to heal her from Lyme disease.
I had just made a decision that I felt like I had plateaued, and they'd done their job, and now it was time to stop. I still do an occasional dose of antibiotics, but certainly not every single day. I'm finding that I'm maintaining. My life is going well right now. The bee venom makes me feel good.
Apitherapy is more than just bee stings and venom. The honeybee itself is a fascinating little creature.
I now look and view at a honeybee hive as a medicine chest. Everything inside of a honeybee hive has medicinal and nutritional benefits.
Propolis, we know, is an antibiotic, has antibiotic properties. That's the tree sap that they use. To a bee, that's their paint, plaster, and it's used to keep the hive sterile. Pollen is a bee's protein. Then there's honey itself, which just recently now they're beginning to find out will kill antibiotic-resistant staph and infections. Royal jelly is a very complex bunch of proteins and hormones and amino acids, and what the bees do with it is amazing.
Royal jelly is a substance that is produced by young nurse bees in a gland in their head. If the bee is going to be a queen bee, there's a special cell constructed, and it is packed with the substance royal jelly, and that is what makes this egg develop to be a queen bee. It is also fed to her for the duration of her entire life.
Rhea has a new lease on life. She can once again live her life without pain.
She was bound and determined to make this work for her, and I believe it did. It really helped her out a lot.
Some people will make full recoveries from Lyme disease. Other people will not. It is a 50-50 chance. The most important thing is catching it early and eradicating it.
It's a struggle, and it's a shame it's such a struggle.
Lyme disease is devastating, and some of the lucky ones do recover, such as I have. I'm here today, I'm healthy today, I am helping people get well. I never expected it to take me where it has, in stinging nearly 3,000 people in the last 8 years. I'm back up, I'm on my feet, I'm ready to go again.
Today, Rhea Carlson says she's in excellent overall health, and for her, no measurement of success can compare with the joy and the privilege of helping to ease the pain of others.